In the year 258 AD, deep within the Roman Empire, a young man met a gruesome fate, was slowly cooked alive atop a metal grate set over open flames. As fire consumed his flesh and scorching iron branded his skin, onlookers witnessed something beyond comprehension. He smiled. Even more astonishing, when his torturers intensified the fire, anticipating cries of agony, they were instead met with words that would reverberate across centuries. "Turn me over. I'm done. On this side." This wasn't insanity or fevered delusion. This was Saint Laurencia, Christian deacon, whose martyrdom would stand as one of history's most profound demonstrations of spiritual conviction, triumphing over the most savage torture devised by the ancient world. Lawrence's death was far more than a grim account of religious persecution. It exposed the intricate entanglement of authority, belief, and the resilience of the human spirit in a civilization where execution was theater and the harshest penalties were saved for those who dared defy imperial norms. His public killing was intended not simply to end a life, but to shatter the morale of an entire faith community through a graphic display of unthinkable torment. What makes Lawrence's ordeal especially chilling isn't just the method used, but the psychological terror it embodied. Roman officials understood that how a person died could either crush or inspire. They selected the Gridiron, a slow, deliberate burn engineered to prolong agony and amplify humiliation, believing it would serve as proof of Christian helplessness. But their meticulously crafted display of dominance unraveled. Rather than observing the disintegration of faith under fire, the assembled witnesses saw something that upended their understanding of both humanity and divinity. Instead of screams, Lawrence answered with wit and composure, as though the fire was a mere nuisance. Early Christian chroniclers like Prudentius, later theologians such as St. Ambrose, documented not only Lawrence's last words, but the broader strategy of cruelty behind his faith. This was no impulsive execution. It was part of a calculated strategy to dismantle the Christian church, its assets, its leaders, and its very sense of hope. To truly comprehend the horror Lawrence endured, one must trace his journey back to his roots in Spain, through the corridors of Vatican influence, and into the mindset of an emperor whose reign would become infamous for its methodical religious persecution. Only then can we appreciate why the death of a single young deacon would echo so powerfully that it would help reshape the very empire that tried to erase him. By 258 AD, the Roman Empire was straining under immense pressure. Emperor Valerian's rule extended from the edges of Britain to the banks of the Euphrates, but his hold on power was growing weaker. Inflation ravaged the economy, and barbarian incursions strained military defenses on multiple fronts. What troubled traditional Roman minds most deeply was the rapid spread of foreign faiths among both the enslaved and free citizens. Chief among these was Christianity, which had evolved from a minor Jewish offshoot into a formidable movement challenging the very pillars of Rome's religious and societal structures. Valerian's response to this growing threat was markedly more strategic than that of earlier emperors. While his predecessors had relied on intermittent and locally driven persecution, Valerian initiated what historians now regard as the first empire-wide, systematic campaign aimed at religious eradication. His decrees, issued in 257 and 258 AD, were not random acts of violence, but carefully crafted tools of suppression. They targeted key pillars of the Christian faith, its clergy, and wealthy patrons who supported the infrastructure of the expanding church. The emperor's reasoning was ruthlessly pragmatic. Rather than exhaust imperial resources executing common followers, he aimed to dismantle the Christian movement by eliminating its leadership and seizing its assets. Bishops, priests, and deacons were ordered to partake in state religious rites or face immediate death. Christian burial grounds were shut down. Gatherings for worship were outlawed under pain of death, and Christian aristocrats were stripped of their possessions and status. Rome itself had become a crucible of religious friction. According to modern estimates, Christians made up around 10% of the city's inhabitants. They had grown increasingly visible, organizing charitable systems, managing clandestine catacombs for the dead, and most controversially, refusing to take part in the imperial cult, the ceremonial backbone that spiritually unified the sprawling empire. Their refusal to burn incense before the emperor's image was seen not merely as dissent, but as treasonous defiance. Under Pope Sixtus II, the Christian institution embodied everything Valerian feared. Not a scattered group of secret worshippers, but a well-coordinated entity with a structured hierarchy, considerable financial resources, and a far-reaching network. The church's wealth, administered by deacons like Lawrence, sustained not only local efforts, but supported believers throughout the empire. In this turbulent context, Lawrence emerged as a towering figure, chief deacon of Rome, head of the papal treasury, and one of the most influential leaders in the Christian establishment. This prominence made him a prime target for Roman enforcers, seeking to break the church and seize its assets, and a living emblem of resistance to imperial control. The clash between empire and faith had reached a critical point. Lawrence's rise from the rural terrain of Hispania to the heart of ecclesiastical power in Rome mirrored a classical hero's ascent. Ironically, it was this very ascent that would ensure his downfall. Born around 225 AD in what is today northeastern Spain, Lawrence was shaped by a region where Roman customs and local culture had fused, producing a distinct Christian environment. The church in Hispania had a reputation for cultivating learned and capable leadersmen who combined intellectual depth in theology with a gift for practical administration. From an early age, Lawrence distinguished himself not through mystical experiences or miraculous deeds, but through an extraordinary knack for administration and leadership. When the man who would become Pope Sixtus II met Lawrence during a visit to Spain, he quickly saw in the young man the rare organizational abilities that the expanding Roman Church urgently needed. Receiving a summons to Rome was both an exceptional honor and a significant gamble. In the 250s, the city presented Christians with a puzzling duality. On one hand, they were able to live relatively normal lives, running businesses, raising families, and even occupying minor public offices. But this apparent stability masked an ever-present danger. A sudden imperial decree, a local disturbance, or even an unfounded rumor could instantly turn law-abiding Christians into fugitives. For a provincial newcomer, surviving and thriving in such a volatile atmosphere required rare adaptability. Lawrence's swift ascension through the church's leadership ranks is a testament to both his capabilities and the critical demand for strong leaders within the Christian fold. As archdeacon, he oversaw church finances, supervised charitable initiatives, and managed a vast web of interpersonal connections vital to the community's survival. This role gave him access to highly sensitive knowledge, not just the whereabouts of church assets, but also the identities and residences of believers throughout the city. Such information was a treasure trove for Roman authorities. In the context of the 3rd century church, the position of chief deacon carried immense responsibility. Lawrence wasn't merely an accountant. He was effectively overseeing a parallel welfare system. The Roman Christian network fed thousands each day, provided for widows and orphans, paid ransoms for captives, and ensured dignified burials for the poor. These charitable operations, while a beacon for converts, had also made the church prosperousand, thus threatening to Roman leadership. By the year 258 AD, Lawrence had become one of the most recognizable leaders within the Roman Christian community. His role required constant interaction with both Christians and pagans, making him a critical mediator between increasingly conflicting cultures. Fluent in both Latin and Greek, versed in Roman law and customs, and endowed with diplomatic finesse, Lawrence had everything needed to navigate the dangerous politics of the imperial capital. Ironically, these very strengths made his eventual fate all the more disturbing to those who witnessed it. The arrest of Pope Sixtus II on the 6th of August, 258, sent tremors through the Christian faithful in Rome. Acting under Emperor Valerian's direct orders, Roman troops stormed the underground catacombs of San Callisto during a secret service, apprehending the Pope and several of his deacons. This was no accident of timing. The raid was meticulously planned. Catching the church's leaders in a single sweep allowed the empire to justify their swift executions legally. Within hours, Sixtus and his companions were put to death, their martyrdom intended as both a sentence and a message. Lawrence, having not been present at the fatal ceremony, suddenly found himself the highest-ranking Christian left in the city and the most wanted. The burden Lawrence carried was immense. Thousands of believers looked to him for direction, while Roman officials regarded him as the linchpin holding together the remnants of the Christian organization. He had become both the most vital figure in the church and the most wanted man in Rome. Following Emperor Valerian's explicit orders concerning ecclesiastical assets, the Roman prefect summoned Lawrence for questioning. This encounter, which took place in the prefect's private chambers, was less a formal arrest and more of a high-stakes negotiation. Roman law regarding asset seizure was intricate, and the authorities required Lawrence's assistance to lawfully confiscate church property. The prefect extended what seemed a pragmatic offer: hand over the church's riches and possibly be spared. But what unfolded was a dialogue that exposed the vast chasm between Roman and Christian ideologies. While the prefect imagined wealth in terms of gold, jewels, and luxury, Lawrence interpreted treasure through a radically different lens. He requested 3 days to gather what the church valued most. The Romans, interpreting his request as compliance, granted, the delay unaware that they had just been cleverly misled by a man poised to subvert their expectations entirely. Over those 3 days, Lawrence acted swiftly and with purpose. He dispersed the church's valuables among the poor, liquidated assets to aid Christian families, and took steps to protect as many fellow believers as he could. He understood that the decisions he made in these final moments would not only determine his personal fate, but influence the survival of Christianity in Rome. Every choice carried profound consequences for the vulnerable who depended on the church's care. The mental strain he endured must have been unimaginable. Lawrence faced a cruel dilemma: yield and betray everything he stood for, or refuse and suffer a death engineered to break both body and spirit. Yet records suggest he faced this impossible situation with striking composure and even flashes of wit. He appeared to grasp something critical, that his death might achieve far more than his continued life. A belief that, in time, would prove startlingly accurate, a bold challenge to Roman pride. On the 10th of August, 258, Lawrence returned to the prefect as agreed, but instead of delivering treasure chests overflowing with gold and silver, he arrived escorted by hundreds of Rome's most destitute, the blind, the crippled, widows, orphans. These were the very people sustained by the church's charitable efforts, those deemed lowest in Rome's rigid social order. As the astonished prefect looked on, Lawrence gestured toward the crowd of the afflicted and declared, "These are the church's true treasures." The sheer defiance of this act is hard to exaggerate. In a culture where wealth equated to dominance and poverty to disgrace, Lawrence had just turned Roman ideology on its head. Those whom society dismissed as useless, the enslaved, the sick, the poor were, in Christian eyes, of incalculable worth. This was far more than symbolic defiance. It was a direct affront to the very ideological foundations of the Roman Empire. The prefect's fury was immediate and intense. What had started as a simple effort to seize church property had spiraled into a spectacle of public disgrace. Roman officials were used to obedience, fear, and submission from their subjects. Instead, they encountered a man who appeared completely unfazed by their authority, someone who had flipped their demand into an act of bold ridicule. The meticulous legal procedures that Valerian had put in place were now cast aside. What mattered more was restoring Roman dominance in the face of this humiliating challenge. The order to execute Lawrence by roasting him alive on a metal grate wasn't an impulsive act of cruelty. It was a carefully calculated act of psychological domination. The Romans understood the persuasive force of theatrical punishment, and public executions fulfilled several roles: enforcing justice, deterring rebellion, and providing visceral entertainment. The execution method selected for Lawrence was designed for maximum effect: slow enough to inflict prolonged torment, visible enough to shock the public, and cruel enough to extinguish any thoughts of Christian martyrdom as noble or heroic. The instrument of death, a metal gridiron, was a work of calculated horror. Composed of interlocking iron bars, it was engineered to distribute heat evenly across the body, inflicting severe burns without hastening death. The condemned would be fastened to the iron frame and placed over a fire meticulously tended to maintain a consistent temperature. This would allow the slow charring of flesh while avoiding death by immediate trauma or suffocation. Roman executioners were highly trained professionals who knew the limits of human endurance. They understood how to manage heat levels to prolong suffering and ensure that victims stayed conscious as long as possible. Every element, the angle of the body, when to flip the condemned, how to stoke the fire was precisely planned to leave an unforgettable impression on every witness, whether Christian or pagan. As news spread that the famed Christian deacon would face a public, torturous death, the execution grounds became packed with onlookers. The crowd reflected the diverse makeup of Roman society. Citizens eager for a brutal spectacle, Christians quietly praying for their beloved leader, government officials overseeing the enforcement of imperial policy, and travelers intrigued by the grim occasion. The mood was charged with expectation, dread, and latent aggression. Lawrence, shackled and led forward, displayed no signs of panic. Eyewitness accounts consistently highlight his serenity rather than fear. Roman torturers, skilled in reading the mental state of the condemned, were used to witnessing either complete psychological collapse or exaggerated bravado that quickly disintegrated under duress. But Lawrence presented an anomaly, exuded an unshaken calmness, not forced or performative, but as though he were attending a solemn appointment, rather than walking toward death. The apparatus had been assembled with typical Roman precision. The iron grate, radiated with heat, placed at the exact height above meticulously arranged embers. The temperature had been thoroughly tested hot enough to deliver searing agony, but measured to avoid killing too quickly. This wasn't mere violence. It was calculated cruelty pain, administered with scientific accuracy. Pain as precision technology repurposed as a tool of terror. Engineering meticulously designed to unravel the human will. As Lawrence was stripped and fastened to the iron grate, the audience fell into a tense hush. This was the point in most executions when the condemned would usually cry out, screaming for mercy or invoking their gods for rescue. But what followed was far more disturbing than any expected cries. Instead of howls of agony, the crowd heard something baffling. Lawrence, speak not in panic, but in what sounded eerily like casual conversation. The physical toll on his body was indescribably horrific. Human skin starts to blister at roughly 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the gridiron beneath him was considerably hotter. Wherever the metal touched his body, it scorched the flesh, leaving seared, geometric marks across his torso and limbs. The stench of burning skyna cloying, sickly sweet odor hung heavy in the air, unsettling even the most seasoned Roman guards. Yet the orchestrated ritual of punishment was unraveling. The man expected to scream was speaking clearly. The one meant to be pleading for mercy was engaging in what witnesses would later describe as theological reflection. Instead of cursing his God, he was extolling him. The Empire's fear-inducing apparatus had never encountered anything like this before. Condemned man who utterly refused to adopt the posture of the condemned. As the fire grew more intense and the metal beneath him glowed hotter, Lawrence's behavior became even more incomprehensible. Rather than mentally collapsing under excruciating pain, he maintained what was described as a rational, even articulate, dialogue with his torturers, clear-minded, despite the savagery being inflicted on him. Roman officials, trained to anticipate the phases of mental breakdown under extreme torture, were now faced with something they could not interpret. Then came the line that would echo through centuries. Assum est, versa, et manduca. This side is done. Turn me over and eat. Far from gibberish, the Latin, quip documented by several witnesses, was razor-sharp wordplay. Lawrence had compared himself to roasted meat, mocking the executioner's failure to destroy his spirit, even as they destroyed his body. This was no hysterical outburst. It was deliberate resistance laced with humora. Defiance so composed it unsettled even the hardened professionals administering his torment. The effect on the executioners was immediate and disorienting. They were veterans of pain, masters of how suffering fragmented the mind. Their knowledge of the human threshold for agony made them terrifyingly efficient. And yet, in Lawrence, they encountered something aliena prisoner who seemed in control, calmly offering commentary on his own execution, apparently unaffected by the horror surrounding him. The Roman crowd, who had gathered expecting a display of Christian submission and fear, instead found themselves witnessing something that upended their understanding of human nature. Restlessness stirred through the audience, and unease born from a spectacle that was no longer following its usual script. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, some suggesting divine involvement, others murmuring about mystical forces. The execution, intended to showcase the unshakable might of the Roman state, was instead provoking uneasy questions about the legitimacy of that power. The executioners, adhering to the expected protocol, did in fact turn Lawrence over. Yet their actions now appeared more like compliance with his wishes than enforcement of imperial punishment. Every movement of the grate, every tweak to the flames, seemed to unfold at Lawrence's prompting rather than through Roman command. Somehow, the traditional roles had reversed. The man being incinerated was now the one commanding the moment. Christian writers of the time documented further words spoken by Lawrence during his agony prayers, calling for Rome's spiritual awakening and heartfelt thanks for being considered worthy of martyrdom. Whether these declarations are historically precise or later embellishments, they reveal something extraordinary. Never before in Roman records had a condemned person used their own torture as a stage for proclamation instead of surrender. The response from the audience that day is regarded as one of the clearest instances of mass psychological shift in classical history. What began as routine state theater, the graphic destruction of an imperial enemy, was slowly morphing into something far more complex. Instead of validating Roman supremacy over Christian weakness, the spectacle prompted observers to reconsider what truly defined strength and defeat. The makeup of the crowd made this transformation especially powerful. These were not secret believers or religious outliers. They were average Roman citizens, thoroughly indoctrinated in imperial doctrine and accustomed to the cultural expectations of such executions. They knew the ritual. Attend, observe justice, absorb the lesson, and carry on. But as Lawrence endured his torture without breaking down, the well-established narrative began to crumble. Public executions typically followed a script. The condemned might first display bravado, but under torture they would inevitably falter, pleading, weeping, begging for death. This emotional arc served a purpose. It affirmed Rome's ability to dominate any opposition. It entertained, and it reminded the masses of the price of rebellion. Lawrence's performance defied that arc. He wasn't collapsing. He wasn't pleading. He was speaking with purpose. And this shattered the emotional logic of the ritual. The crowd's confusion grew louder. Whispers turned to debates. Some rationalized the scene with familiar cultural explanations. Perhaps the condemned man was under the influence of sorcery from distant lands. Or maybe Rome's own gods were placing the empire through a divine test. But more troubling theories began to circulate. What if the Christian deity was, in fact, stronger than Rome's pantheon? Even more disturbing was a deeper realization creeping in among some observers. Maybe, in this scenario, the empire was the villain. This shift didn't happen instantly or uniformly. Different segments of the crowd reacted at different paces, some with incredulity, others with concern, some with quiet admiration. Conversations sprang up across the audience, turning the once passive spectacle into a forum of speculation and unrest. Roman authorities quickly recognized the threat. History had shown that when executions swayed public sentiment, they could spark more than outrage. They could lead to uprisings, instability, and even direct challenges to imperial control. What had started as a display of dominance was now on the verge of becoming an undeniable portrait of impotence. The turning point in the crowd's perception came when Lawrence, after enduring prolonged torture, lifted his head not to speak to his tormentors, but to address the Roman prefect directly. According to various accounts, he expressed gratitude for being given the chance to demonstrate the strength of Christian faith and prayed openly for the conversion of the Roman Empire. This final gesture, whether seen as bold defiance or a profound act of compassion, left even the most battle-hardened Roman officials speechless. When Lawrence finally succumbed, his death, like the rest of his execution, defied expectations. After hours of unimaginable suffering, he passed not with angry shouts or bitter curses, but with what witnesses described as a prayer of gratitude. Even in his final moments, the man who had turned every imperial assumption about human endurance on its head managed to make his death an expression of worship rather than surrender. Chaos ensued immediately after the execution. The crowd, initially drawn by the promise of public punishment, found themselves reeling from an event that shattered conventional categories. Roman authorities, suddenly aware that their attempt to reinforce dominance had unintentionally revealed Christian resilience, moved fast to scatter the crowd and control the narrative. But it was already too late. Too many had seen something that contradicted the foundational myths of Roman strength and Christian frailty. Word of Lawrence's martyrdom spread through the city at lightning speed, propelled by the sheer shock of what had occurred. Details became embellished, but the heart of the story remained. A Christian deacon had endured the worst of Roman torture and somehow emerged victorious. For a city that relied on rigid boundaries between victor and vanquished, the implications were deeply destabilizing. The Christian response came swiftly and forcefully. Rather than being silenced by fears, Valerian's campaign had intended, Roman Christians found themselves emboldened by Lawrence's example. The extremity of his suffering, paired with the poise and conviction he exhibited throughout, forged a potent symbol of defiance that imperial might could not extinguish. In death, Lawrence proved even more powerful than he had been in life. It didn't take long for Roman officials to realize their miscalculation. The event meant to demonstrate that Christian defiance was futile had instead gifted the Christian movement with its most enduring emblem. What was supposed to be a warning had become a rallying cry. Rather than reinforcing Roman supremacy, Lawrence's death was being interpreted as a decisive moral victory for Christianity. The tools of imperial terror had failed undone by a single man who refused to be conquered by fear. The fallout was immediate and widespread. New Christian converts began proclaiming their beliefs openly, undeterred by threats of persecution. The church's charitable networks, those very systems Lawrence had risked everything to protect, reassembled with renewed energy and purpose. Perhaps most significantly, ordinary Romans began to take notice. They started to ask difficult questions about a faith that could inspire such extraordinary courage in the face of such monstrous cruelty. The execution had dramatically backfired, accomplishing the very opposite of what Roman authorities had intended. Lawrence's martyrdom marked a pivotal moment in the evolving dynamic between the Roman state and the Christian faith, though the broader ramifications wouldn't be fully realized for several generations. In the immediate wake of his death, Emperor Valerian's campaign of persecution actually intensified. Recognizing that their conventional methods of repression were failing, imperial leaders doubled down. But this escalation only underscored the increasing anxiety of a regime unable to suppress a belief system that appeared to gain momentum with every act of violence against it. Among Christians, Lawrence's death became the benchmark by which martyrdom was measured. His rare combination of organizational brilliance, theological insight, and unshakable resolve under brutal torture became a source of inspiration for countless future leaders. More profoundly, his transformation of agony into testimony gave the Christian world a new framework. That suffering could serve a divine purpose, becoming not just bearable, but sacred. The church that emerged from the flames of Valerian's persecution was not diminished, it was reinvigorated. It had become more resilient, more cohesive, and more assertive. At the same time, Roman society itself was being reshaped in ways that deeply unsettled the political establishment. Hundreds had witnessed Lawrence's execution firsthand, and they spread his story throughout the empire with an evangelistic zeal of their own. The tale of the deacon who responded to torture with wit, dignity, and unwavering faith became a compelling narrative weapon. It showed that the strength of Christian conviction could surpass the most refined instruments of Roman cruelty. Ironically, the very performance meant to deter conversions was now fueling them. Lawrence's martyrdom reverberated through the formation of Christian theological thought, particularly around themes of suffering and redemption. Influential thinkers like St. Ambrose and St. Augustine would later build upon his example, crafting intricate doctrines to explain how individual pain could align with divine cosmic intention. His death offered tangible proof that faith could convert even unspeakable torment into something transcendent and transformative, a foundation that would become central to Christian soteriology. Politically, the event revealed limitations to Roman authority that even its rulers had not grasped. The empire could dominate the body with impunity, but it struggled to conquer belief, resolve, and spirit. This failure to control the inner world of its subjects would eventually lead to a significant shift in state policy, culminating decades later in Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which granted religious tolerance to Christians. Perhaps most enduringly, Lawrence's death reshaped ideas about the intersection of temporal rule and spiritual authority. His ability to preserve his humor, composure, and devotion, even in the face of unspeakable torment, suggested that real strength resided not in domination but in conviction. It was a radical redefinition of power, one that would inform Western ideals of human dignity, individual rights, and moral resistance to tyranny. 17 centuries later, the account of St. Lawrence's martyrdom still echoes with urgency. It probes essential questions about who we are, why we suffer, and where we find meaning, in reminding us that defiance can coexist with compassion, and that courage can outlast cruelty. Lawrence's legacy continues to speak to the modern soul as powerfully as it did to ancient Rome. In a time when we often convince ourselves that the savagery of the past is behind us, the story of Lawrence serves as a stark reminder. The potential for both immense cruelty and extraordinary courage remains an enduring part of what it means to be human. What lends Lawrence's story its unique power is not simply the horror of what he endured, but how he responded to it. In a society where the concept of victimhood often shapes how we interpret suffering, Lawrence presents a striking counter-narrative of triumph through seeming defeat. His steadfast refusal to surrender to torture, his unwavering humanity amid inhumane torment, and his transformation of execution into an act of devotion all challenge our comfortable ideas about strength, vulnerability, and the essence of true victory. The documented account of Lawrence's martyrdom also poses profound questions that continue to puzzle modern minds, especially about the interplay between belief and logic. How do we explain actions that contradict our understanding of mental and physical limits? What does it suggest about the human spirit that someone could preserve lucidity, wit, and empathy while undergoing pain severe enough to strip most of their identity away? There are no simple answers, but such questions compel us to acknowledge that human nature may possess hidden depths we have yet to fully comprehend. The Roman Empire that executed Lawrence would eventually declare itself Christian, though whether that shift was a sincere spiritual awakening or a calculated political move is still debated. What's indisputable, however, is that the Rome that canonized figures like Lawrence was no longer the same empire that had once tried to extinguish them. The ideals for which Lawrence gave his life, compassion for the impoverished, respect for human dignity, and the prioritization of the spiritual over the material, would later become pillars of Western moral thought. Today, as religious oppression persists across many regions of the globe, Lawrence's life offers both motivation and provocation. His martyrdom proves that no regime, no matter how authoritarian, can truly conquer people who are prepared to suffer for their beliefs. But it also confronts us with a more personal challenge. Are we prepared to stand firm for the values we profess, especially when doing so brings real cost? The man who maintained a serene smile while being burned alive on a Roman grate bequeathed to us more than just a tale of heroic faith. He offered a deep, enduring meditation on what it means to be truly human in dignity and suffering, on strength rooted in belief, and on the paradox that what looks like defeat may, in fact, be the greatest form of victory. Even now, in a world still wrestling with the meaning of power, pain, and purpose, the legacy of the Spanish deacon who humbled the Roman Empire continues to resonate with undiminished clarity.